Nobody in the kingdom of Averholt could remember the last time the palace gates had stayed shut for 11 days in a row. Not for a storm, not for mourning, not even in the old winters when the roads froze and the guards had to break the ice off the great doors with hammers. But for 11 days now, the tall iron gates had not opened once, and the whole country had begun to hold its breath. It started with a small thing, a cancelled visit. The Crown Prince had been due to open a new bridge in the river town of Halden, and everyone in Halden had spent a week sweeping their streets and hanging flags. Then the night before, a short message came from the palace. The visit was postponed. No reason was given. People shrugged. Princes were busy men. These things happened. But then the next visit was cancelled too, and the one after that. The princess, who was loved even more than her husband, did not appear at the spring festival, though she had opened it every year since her wedding. Her seat stayed empty, a soft green cushion under a canopy, and the crowd kept glancing at it all afternoon as if she might still arrive. She did not. And when the festival ended and the lanterns were lit and still no word had come, the whispering began. By the 5th day, the whispering had grown into something louder. In the markets, in the bakeries, on the ferry that crossed the wide gray river, people talked of nothing else. What was wrong at the palace? Some said the prince and princess had quarreled, that a great crack had opened in their marriage. Some said the old king, the prince's father, had fallen ill again and the family was keeping it quiet. Some said darker things, things they only said in low voices with their hands half over their mouths, because in Averholt it was considered bad luck to speak of a royal death before it happened. The newspapers, of course, printed all of it. One paper showed a blurred photograph of a doctor's car leaving the palace grounds at night, and under it the words, "Who is sick?" Another paper claimed a servant had seen the princess crying in a corridor. A third simply printed a black page with a single question in white letters, and that question was the one everyone was already asking in their own hearts. What are they hiding from us? And through all of it, the palace said nothing. Inside those quiet gates, the truth was both smaller and far bigger than any of the rumors. It was not a quarrel. The prince and princess had never in their lives been closer than they were now. It was not the old king, who was, in fact, resting well in his summer house by the sea, unaware of how much the country feared for him. The truth was something that the princess had carried alone for a long time, longer than anyone knew, and it was a truth she had chosen to hide precisely because she loved her people too much to frighten them. Her name was Aloan. She had come to the palace 9 years ago as a young woman from a modest family in the hill country, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, and the whole kingdom had watched her wedding with tears in their eyes because she was one of their own, plain-spoken and warm, a princess who still remembered how to laugh at herself. She had a way of making even the grandest room feel like a kitchen where friends had gathered. When she visited hospitals, she sat on the edge of the beds. When she visited schools, she got down on the floor with the smallest children. People did not just admire her, they felt she belonged to them. And now she sat by a tall window in a private room on the upper floor of the palace, wrapped in a soft blanket even though it was spring, and she watched the empty courtyard below and thought about how much she owed those people, and how much she was about to ask of them. 3 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday, a doctor had told her something that changed the shape of her whole world. She had not felt well for some weeks, a tiredness that sleep did not fix, a weight in her body she could not explain away. She had said nothing to anyone, not even her husband at first, because she had told herself it was only the long winter, only the endless work, only the ordinary cost of a life lived always in front of other people's eyes. But the tiredness did not lift, and one gray morning she quietly asked the palace doctor to run some tests, and she asked him to tell no one. The results were not good. She had sat very still when he told her. She had asked him to say it again, slowly, and he had, and she had nodded as if he were explaining a change to a schedule rather than a threat to her life. It was, the doctor said carefully, treatable. That was the word he kept returning to, treatable, and she held on to it like a rope. But treatment would be long, and it would be hard, and there would be times when she would be too weak to leave her rooms, and there would be no hiding those times from the world if she carried on as before. For a full day she told no one. She walked the palace gardens alone, past the roses that were only beginning to bud, and she thought about her mother, who was still alive in the hill country and who would break in half if she heard the news badly. She thought about her children, two of them, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, who did not know yet that the world could take their mother from them. And she thought strangely about the kingdom, about all the people who looked to her, who had built her into a kind of light in their lives, and what it would do to them to see that light flicker. That evening she told her husband. The crown prince was named Cassian, and though the country thought of him as a serious man, careful with his words, slow to smile in public, in private he was nothing of the sort. With Aloan he was foolish and gentle and quick to laugh. And when she told him, sitting on the floor of their private rooms with her back against the sofa because she could not bear to sit up straight, he did not say anything clever or kingly. He simply slid down onto the floor beside her and put his arms around her and held her while the light left the sky, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When at last he did speak, his voice was rough. He told her that whatever came, they would face it together, and that he did not care what it cost or what anyone thought. He would put her before the crown, before the country, before everything, because she was his whole heart and always had been. She had cried then, not from fear but from being so completely held. But even in that first night, as they held each other, a harder question sat in the room with them, and they both knew it. What would they tell the people? Cassian's first instinct was silence. Protect her. Draw the curtains, close the gates, cancel everything, let the doctors do their work far from the eyes of the world. Let the country think what it liked. He would rather the whole kingdom believe he had gone mad, he said, than have them watch his wife suffer. But Aloan shook her head slowly. She understood the wish to hide. Part of her wanted nothing more. But she knew her people. She knew that silence would not comfort them. Silence would only feed their fear, and their fear would turn into rumors, and the rumors would grow uglier by the day until they had built a story far worse than the truth. She had seen it happen to others. She did not want the last thing she gave her people, if it came to that, to be confusion and dread. Still, she was not ready. Not yet. The treatment had to begin first, quietly. The doctors needed weeks to understand how her body would respond, whether the medicine would work, whether the news, when it finally came, could carry a shape of hope or only a shape of fear. It would be cruel, she felt, to frighten the whole kingdom before she herself knew what she was facing. And so a decision was made, a decision that would cost them dearly in the weeks to come. For a little while they would say nothing. They would cancel what had to be canceled. They would let the world wonder. And when the time was right, when there was something true and steady to say, they would open the gates and face their people honestly. That was the plan. It had seemed wise in that first raw night. It had not felt like hiding. It had felt like waiting for the right moment to be brave. But no one had counted on how long 11 days could feel to a frightened country, or on how loud a silence could become. Now in the upper room by the window, Aloan watched the courtyard and felt the weight of that silence pressing on the whole palace. She had come through the worst of the first weeks of treatment. She was thinner, and her hair had begun to change, and there were mornings when even lifting a cup felt like lifting a stone. But the doctors, cautiously, had begun to use a different tone. The medicine was working. Not finished, not certain, but working. The rope she had been holding had begun, very slightly, to pull her upward. And with that small light had come a decision she could no longer put off. It was time. The people had waited long enough. The Rummas had grown too wild. That very morning she had told Cassian that she wanted to speak, not through a spokesman, not through a printed statement passed under the gates. She wanted to stand where her people could see her, and she wanted to tell them the truth in her own voice, her own words, so that they would know it came from her and not from anyone else. Cassian had been afraid for her, not of the words but of the strength it would take, to stand in front of the whole kingdom, weakened as she was, and speak plainly about the thing she feared most, and to do it without breaking. He worried it would cost her more than she had to give. But when he looked at her face, he saw something he had learned long ago not to argue with. She had made up her mind. And so, quietly, he had begun to arrange it. They would not do it from a distant balcony, high and cold. They would do it from the low steps at the front of the palace, where the people could gather close, where she could look into faces rather than out over a sea of heads. It would be in 2 days' time. Word would go out that morning, so that whoever wished to come could come. And the prince and princess would step through those long-shut gates together and tell their country the truth. The plan set, the palace changed. There was a strange, hushed busyness to it now, servants moving with new purpose, arrangements being made, guards being briefed. And through it all, Ulupn rested and gathered her strength, because she knew that in 2 days she would need every drop of it. But that afternoon, before any of that could come to pass, something small happened that neither of them had planned for, something that would matter more than either of them yet understood. The children found out. It was the little girl, the 4-year-old, who noticed first. Children notice everything, even the things adults are certain they have hidden well. She had noticed that her mother was tired all the time now. She had noticed the quiet, careful way the servants spoke, the way her father's face went soft and worried when he thought no one was looking. And that afternoon she wandered into her mother's room, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear, and climbed up onto the window seat without a word and pressed her small, warm body against her mother's side, and stayed there, quiet, for a long time. Then she looked up and asked, in the plain and terrible way that only small children can, whether her mother was going to be all right. Ulupn looked down at that small face, at those wide, serious eyes, and for a moment she could not speak at all. She had rehearsed how she would tell a whole kingdom. She had not rehearsed how she would tell this. And she understood in that moment that the words she found for her daughter now were the truest test of all, because a child cannot be soothed with clever phrases. A child only believes what is real. So she told her the truth, gently, in the smallest and simplest words she had. She told her that her body was sick, but that clever doctors were helping her, and that the medicine was strong, and that every day she was working very hard to get better. She did not promise what she could not promise. But she held her daughter close and told her that no matter what happened, the love between them was a thing that could never be sick, never be tired, never go away, and that it would be there always, brighter than anything. The little girl thought about this for a while, in the deep way children think. Then she said that she would help. She would bring her mother her rabbit every day, because the rabbit was very good at making people feel better, and she said it so seriously, so sure of the healing power of a stuffed rabbit, that Ulupn laughed for the first time in days, a real laugh that turned halfway into tears. It was Kashan, standing in the doorway, who saw the whole thing. He had come to tell his wife that the arrangements were made, and instead he stood very still and watched his daughter offer her rabbit to her mother as a cure, and he felt something turn over in his chest. He had been thinking of the announcement as a duty, a hard thing to be survived, but watching them there in the pale window light, he understood suddenly that it was something else. It was not only about calming the country. It was about being honest with the people they served in the same way Ulupn had just been honest with their child. Because the kingdom, in its way, was frightened just like that little girl, and it too deserved the truth told gently and told true. That evening the two of them talked for a long time about what she would say, not the polished speech that advisors had begun to draft, full of careful phrases and safe words. Ulupn did not want that. She pushed the papers aside. She said she wanted to speak plainly, the way she had spoken to her daughter, to tell the people what was wrong, to thank them for their patience, and to apologize for the fear the silence had caused. And then, and this was the part she cared about most, she wanted to give them something to hold on to, not false comfort, something real. Because in the long, quiet weeks of her illness, lying awake in the small hours, Ulupn had thought a great deal about all the others in her kingdom who were fighting the same fight she was, in far harder circumstances than her own. She had a warm room and the finest doctors and a husband who held her through the worst nights. But out there, across the country, thousands of ordinary people were facing the very same illness in cold houses, alone, afraid, without the help she took for granted. She had never thought about them properly before. Now she could think of little else. And she had begun to feel that if she was going to stand before her people and speak of her own suffering, she had no right to do it unless she also did something for theirs. So she had made a decision, and she told Cassian, and his eyes shone when he heard it. When she stood on those steps, she would not only tell the country the truth about herself. She would announce something new, something built out of her own hard months, a promise to turn her private fight into a public good, so that no one in Overholt would ever again have to face this illness as alone as so many faced it now. She did not yet know exactly how she would say it. She only knew that this was the true heart of the announcement, the reason it mattered, the thing that would turn a frightening day into a day of hope. The illness had taken much from her, but it had also opened her eyes, and she was determined that something good would grow from all this fear, something that would outlast her whether she recovered or not. That night, long after the children were asleep, Ulupton stood again at the tall window and looked out over the dark city beyond the palace walls. Lights glowed in 1,000 windows. In each of those windows was a family, a life, people who had spent 11 anxious days wondering what was wrong with her, people who loved her without ever having met her. In 2 days she would open the gates and walk out to them, weak in body but clear in heart, and she would tell them everything. She was afraid. She would not have been human if she were not. But underneath the fear was something steadier, something that had grown in her all through these hard weeks, and it felt almost like peace. She had spent her whole life as princess learning how to stand in front of crowds and say the right things. In 2 days she would stand in front of the largest crowd of her life and for once say the truest thing. Behind her, the door opened softly, and Cassian came and stood beside her at the window, and without a word he took her hand. Together they looked out at the glowing city and the dark river beyond it, and the long-shut gates below, gates that would soon open onto a moment that neither the couple nor their kingdom would ever forget. Down in the city, unaware of any of this, the people went to their beds still wondering, still afraid, still whispering their questions into the dark. They did not know that their waiting was almost over. They did not know that in 2 days a tired woman in a plain dress would walk out through those iron gates and change, with a few honest words, the way they understood their princess forever. But she knew, and as she stood there with her hand in her husband's, watching the city she loved, Ulupton made herself a quiet promise. Whatever it cost her, whatever strength it took, she would not flinch. She would walk out those gates on her own 2 feet. She would look her people in the eye. And she would give them not the story the newspapers had invented, but the real one, the whole one. The frightening and the hopeful together, because that was what they deserved, and because it was, in the end, the only gift she had left that was entirely her own to give. 2 days. That was all that stood now between the silent palace and the announcement the whole kingdom was waiting for. And though no one in Overholt yet knew it, those 2 days would be the last quiet ones the country would have for a very long time. The word went out on a bright, cold morning, and by noon the whole of Overholt knew. It was not a grand proclamation. There were no trumpets, no riders in gold thundering through the streets. It was a single short notice, pinned to the palace gates and copied by every newspaper within the hour, and it said only that the crown prince and princess would address the people from the front steps of the palace in 2 days' time, and that all who wished to come were welcome. That was all. No explanation, no hint of what would be said. But after 11 days of silence, those few plain words fell on the country like rain on cracked earth. In the markets, people stopped and read the notice aloud to those who could not read it for themselves. In the schools, teachers set down their chalk and told the children that something important was coming. On the ferry, the old ferryman who had carried passengers across the wide gray river for 40 years read the notice twice, folded the paper carefully, and said to no one in particular that in all his years He had never known the palace to invite the whole country to its doorstep. Something had changed. Everyone could feel it, and though no one yet knew whether the news would be good or terrible, there was a strange relief in simply knowing that, at last, they would be told. Inside the palace, however, there was no relief at all. There was only the enormous, quiet weight of preparation, and beneath it fear. Eloin had risen early that morning, before the notice went out, because she wanted to be strong for the day, and she had learned that her strength was a thing that had to be gathered slowly, like water collected drop by drop through the hours. The treatment had left her body unpredictable. Some mornings she woke feeling almost like herself, and she would let herself hope foolishly that the worst was behind her. Other mornings she woke unable to rise at all, her limbs heavy as wet sand, a deep sickness rolling through her that no amount of will could push back. She never knew which kind of morning she would be given until she opened her eyes. And this frightened her more than anything, because in 2 days she would have to stand and speak, and she had no way of knowing what her body would allow her to do. She said none of this to Cashen. He had enough to carry. The prince had thrown himself into the arrangements with a fierce, restless energy that those close to him recognized as worry wearing the mask of work. He inspected the steps where they would stand. He argued with the guards about how close the crowd should be allowed to come, refusing their advice to keep the people at a safe distance, insisting that Eloin wanted to be near them, to see their faces. He walked the route she would take from the great doors to the steps, counting the paces, worrying over every one of them, wondering whether it was too far, whether there should be somewhere for her to rest, whether it was madness to let her do this at all. 3 times that first day he went to her rooms meaning to tell her she should not go through with it, that they could send a written message instead, that no one would blame her. And 3 times he looked at her face and could not say it, because he saw that she needed to do this the way a drowning person needs air, and to take it from her would be its own kind of cruelty. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at the palace. The old king had come. No one had sent for him. He was meant to be resting at his summer house by the sea, far from the city, and for weeks the family had been careful to keep the truth from him, fearing what the shock might do to his own fragile health. But the old king, though frail, was not a fool, and he had heard the rumors even in his quiet corner of the country. And when the notice about the announcement reached him, he had risen from his chair, called for his car, and made the long journey to the city without telling anyone he was coming. He arrived after dark, leaning heavily on a cane, his coat still dusty from the road, and he asked to see his son at once. Cashen met him in the great hall, and for a moment the 2 men simply looked at each other, the old king and the future one, and the whole weight of the family's secret hung in the air between them. Then the old king asked the question directly, in the blunt way of a man who has grown too old to waste time on gentleness. He asked what was wrong with Eloin. And Cashen, who had held himself together for weeks, who had been strong for his wife and his children and his frightened country, found that in front of his father he could not hold himself together at all. His voice broke on the first word. And there, in the empty great hall, with the tall portraits of dead kings looking down on them, the son told the father everything, and the old king listened, and his lined face grew very still, and when it was told, he stepped forward and took his son in his arms the way he had not done since Cashen was a boy. They stood like that for a long time. When at last the old king drew back, there were tears on his face, but his eyes had hardened into something else, something like resolve. He asked to see her. Eloin was in her upper room resting when they told her the king had come. She rose at once, alarmed, worried what the journey might have cost his health, and she was making her slow way toward the door to go down to him when the door opened and the old king came in himself, unwilling to make her climb down to meet him. He crossed the room, and he took both her thin hands in his own frail ones, and he looked at her for a long moment. He had never been a warm man in public. The country thought of him as stern, distant, carved from old stone. But in that room, holding the hands of his son's wife, the stone fell away entirely. He told her that she was the best thing that had ever come to the family. He told her that in 9 years she had done more to make the people love the crown than he had done in 40 years of trying. And then he told her something that she would carry with her into the frightening day ahead. He told her that he had spent his whole life believing that the strength of a monarch lay in never showing weakness, in standing always tall and cold and certain, and that he had come, too late, to believe he had been wrong about that his entire life. Real strength, he said, was not in hiding what you feared. It was in what she was about to do, walking out to face the people not as a distant figure above them but as one of them, frightened and honest and human. He said he had never been prouder of anyone, and that whatever happened in 2 days' time, she should know that she had already shown more courage than he had managed in a lifetime. Eloin wept then, and the old king held her, and something healed in that room that had been broken for a very long time between the crown and its own heart. But not everyone in the palace shared the old king's view. The next morning, the second and final day before the announcement, the argument came. It had been building for days, and now, with time running out, it broke into the open. The palace advisors, the careful men in gray coats who had served the crown for decades and believed they knew best how to protect it, came to Cashin in a tight, anxious group, and they laid out their fears. This announcement, they said, was a terrible mistake. They were not cruel men. They believed in their way that they were protecting the family, but they had spent their whole careers managing the image of the crown, and to them, the plan was reckless beyond words. To let the princess stand before an open crowd, weakened, and speak plainly of her illness was to hand the country its fear on a plate. It would frighten the people, they said. It would make the crown look vulnerable, breakable, weak. There were enemies who would seize on any sign of weakness. There were foreign powers who watched Averholt closely and would read weakness in the throne as an opening. Far better, they urged, to release a short, controlled written statement, dignified and vague, that admitted the princess was unwell and recovering, and to keep her safely out of sight until she was fully strong again. Manage it. Contain it. Do not, they begged, throw open the gates and let the whole raw truth spill out where it could never be taken back. Cashin listened to all of it, and when they had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. And the advisors thought perhaps they had reached him. They had not. He told them, in a voice that was calm but left no room for argument, that they had misunderstood something fundamental, not just about this moment, but about the entire country they served. He told them that the people of Averholt were not children to be managed. They were not fools to be soothed with careful, empty words. For 11 days those people had been left alone with their fear, and the advisor's precious silence had not protected anyone. It had only fed the rumors until the country was sick with dread. The people did not need to be protected from the truth, he said. They needed to be trusted with it, and a crown that could not trust its own people with the truth had no right to ask those people to trust it in return. Then he said the thing that ended the argument. He told them that his wife had decided to do this not because it was safe, but because it was right, and that he would sooner tear the crown from his own head and throw it in the river than stand in her way. And if any man in that room believed that showing the people an honest, frightened, courageous woman would weaken the throne, then that man understood nothing at all about where the true strength of a crown came from. The advisors left in silence. They did not raise the matter again. But the argument, though Cashin had won it, had shaken something loose in him, and that afternoon he went to Eloin troubled, though he tried to hide it. She saw it at once, as she always did. She made him sit beside her, and she asked him plainly what was wrong, and slowly he told her about the advisors, about their fears, about the enemies who might read weakness in her honesty. He had dismissed them to their faces. But now, in the quiet, some small cold part of him wondered whether they were right. What if his need to be honest and hers was a beautiful mistake? What if in trying to comfort the country they only frightened it, and in trying to be human they only made the crown look breakable, and it all went wrong, and it was his fault for letting her do it? Eloin was quiet for a while. Then she told him something she had never told anyone. She told him about a day long ago, before she had ever met him, when she was still just a schoolteacher's daughter from the hill country. Her own mother had been ill that year, gravely ill, and the family had hidden it, the way families do, from the neighbors, from the village, from everyone, out of some idea that illness was a shameful private thing to be borne behind closed doors. And Aloan, who had been a young woman then, had watched her mother suffer that illness almost entirely alone, because the shame of it had built a wall around their house that no help could climb over. Neighbors who would gladly have brought food, sat with her, shared the long nights, never came because they never knew. And her mother had recovered in the end, but Aloan had never forgotten how needlessly, cruelly alone that hidden illness had made them all. She had promised herself, young as she was, that if she ever faced such a thing herself, she would not hide it. She would let people in, because the loneliness, she had learned, was worse than the illness. That, she told Cashin, was why she had to do this, not out of duty to the crown, not out of some calculation about strength or weakness, but because she had once watched what silence did to a suffering family, and she would not do it to her own, and she would not do it to her country. The advisers feared that honesty would make the crown look weak, but Aloan knew something they did not. She knew that the thing that truly bound people together was not the appearance of strength, it was the sharing of what was real. And a country that was allowed to grieve and hope and fear alongside its princess would love her more, not less, for having been let in. Cashin looked at her for a long time, and then his last doubt fell away, and it did not return. That evening, the palace grew quiet, with a different kind of quiet than the frightened hush of the past days. It was the stillness before a great thing, the held breath of a house on the eve of something that could not be undone. The children were bathed and put to bed early, and Aloan went to each of them in turn. To the little girl she read a story, and the little girl fell asleep clutching the stuffed rabbit she had promised would cure her mother. To the boy, who was 6 and old enough to sense that something enormous was happening even if he did not understand it, she sat on the edge of the bed and answered his careful questions as honestly as she could. And she told him that tomorrow she was going to talk to a great many people about being sick and about getting better, and that he might hear grown-ups talking about it, and that he was never to be frightened by the talking, because the truth, spoken out loud, could never hurt them as much as secrets kept in the dark. The boy nodded solemnly, and before she left, he told her that he thought she was the bravest person in the whole kingdom, and Aloan had to stand very still in the doorway for a moment after she left his room before she could trust herself to walk on. Then came the night before, and it was long. Aloan did not sleep much. She lay awake in the dark beside Cashin, who was pretending to sleep so that she would not worry, though she knew perfectly well he was awake, and the two of them lay there in the honest darkness, each keeping their fear from the other out of love, until at last Aloan laughed softly and said she knew he was awake, and he admitted it, and after that they stopped pretending and simply talked quietly through much of the night. They talked about the early days when they had first met before any of this. They talked about their children. They talked once briefly about the thing neither of them ever said aloud, about what would happen if the treatment did not work in the end. And Aloan said only that if that day ever came, she wanted him to remember that she had been happier in 9 years with him than most people managed in a whole long life, and that he was never, ever to think of those years as too short, because they had been full, and a full life was not measured in how long it lasted. Cashin could not answer that. He only held her tighter in the dark. But somewhere in the long hours of that night, the fear in the room slowly turned into something else. Not confidence exactly, something quieter and stronger than confidence, a kind of readiness. They had done all the worrying there was to do. The arguments were over, the arrangements made, the words as ready as they would ever be. All that was left now was to do the thing itself. And there is a peace that comes at the end of long dread, when the waiting is nearly over and the only thing left is to be brave. And that peace came to them at last in the small dark hours, and they slept a little, holding on to each other before the dawn. The morning came gray and still. Aloan woke, and lay for a moment in that first terrible instant of waking when she did not yet know which kind of morning her body had given her, and then she moved, carefully, testing herself, and she found that her limbs would answer her. Not strongly, but enough. She let out a slow breath. It was, she understood, as good a morning as she was likely to be given, and she was fiercely grateful for it because she knew what she was about to ask of herself. They dressed her simply. She had refused the grand gowns, the jewels, all the armor of royalty. She wore a plain dress in a soft green, the color she had always loved, and her hair, changed as it was by the treatment she left as it was, covered lightly but not hidden, because she had decided she would not walk out to her people pretending to be anything other than what she was. When she looked at herself in the tall mirror, she saw a thinner, paler woman than the one the country remembered. For one moment her courage wavered, and she wondered whether they would be shocked, whether they would pity her, whether she should hide more of it after all. And then she thought of her mother, alone behind that wall of shame all those years ago, and she lifted her chin, and the wavering passed and did not come again. Cashin came for her. He was in a dark, plain suit, no medals, no sash, nothing to set him above the people he was walking out to meet. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and for a moment they simply stood together in the quiet of the upper hall, husband and wife, gathering themselves. He asked her very softly whether she was ready. She thought about the question. Then she said that she did not think anyone was ever truly ready for a thing like this, but that she was ready to try, and that with him beside her she was not afraid, and that this was as ready as she would ever be. They began to walk. Down the long upper corridor, past the tall dark portraits of the kings and queens who had come before, none of whom, Aloan thought, had ever done quite what she was about to do. Down the great staircase, slowly, one careful step at a time, Cashin matching his pace to hers without seeming to, so that no one watching would see how much she needed the arm she leaned on. Through the great hall, where the old king waited, standing tall on his cane, and as they passed he inclined his head to her, a small deep bow, king to princess, the highest honor he had, and Aloan felt tears rise and push them down because she could not weep now, not yet. And then they came to the great doors. Beyond them they could hear it now, the sound they had not heard in 11 days, the sound of the people, not a roar, not cheering, something quieter and far more moving than cheering. The low, vast, breathing murmur of an enormous crowd, thousands upon thousands of them, gathered in the great courtyard and spilling back beyond the gates into the streets, more people than anyone had expected, more people perhaps than had ever gathered at the palace in living memory, all of them come to hear what their princess would say, all of them waiting in a hush that pressed against the doors like a held breath. Aloan stopped. She stood before the tall closed doors and she listened to that sound, the sound of her people waiting for her, and her heart beat hard against her ribs. On the other side of those doors was everything she feared and everything she loved, tangled together. On the other side was the moment she had been walking toward through all these long dark weeks, the moment that would tell the whole country the truth at last. Cashin felt her hesitate, and he turned to her, and he did not tell her to be brave, or that it would be all right, or any of the things people say when there is nothing to say. He only looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the whole of their 9 years together, all of it, and she found her strength there where she had always found it. She nodded. She was ready. Cashin gave the signal.